Chapter 24 is looking at how the United States becomes an affluent society in the 1950s in the wake of World War II. Affluent means either wealthy or having a great deal of money, and because of the US's post-war economic power, the 1950s were a period of affluence for a lot of Americans. That said, a lot of these rising incomes and movement into the middle class and rising homeownership, a lot of this affluence is really centered on whites and more specifically white men. So a lot of women are kind of left behind in terms of gender and social relations, and a lot of racial and ethnic minorities are left behind economically and politically as well. So number one, what were the main characteristics of the affluent society of the 1950s? So again, the US enjoyed unprecedented prosperity in the 1950s with the highest standard of living in the world, at least for whites. And that newfound affluence will be used to buy homes. In the 1950s sees the dramatic growth of suburbs as people begin to leave cities and settle into homes in what we would imagine to be like the modern day suburb. Levittown, New York was a model community with practically identical houses all made in a kind of cookie cutter fashion. And this kind of layout becomes the standard model for other suburban developments across the country for the rest of the decade. Worth noting is that suburban living was promoted by a law called the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which created the interstate highway system, making it easier for people to commute from the city where their job is to the suburbs, which are outside of the city. This newfound homeownership is also promoted by the low cost or low interest loans by the GI Bill. Keep in mind who those GI Bill loans are mostly going to, though, and that many women women and African Americans are not able to access these for the most part. So this homeownership is being promoted among a particular group, white men in American society. Also probably worth noting really quickly that the suburbs also spoke to some Cold War fears because they offered possible safety from a nuclear war. They were further out from urban centers, which were likely targets in a nuclear war, and their backyards could serve as possible sites to build, bomb shelters for your family. The 1950s also sees consumer culture become the norm. That means a consumer culture is where your life is really dominated by the purchase of commercial goods like cars and appliances and other things like that. One of those important appliances in the 1950s is a television. By the end of the decade, 9 out of 10 homes had a TV in it. And this is similar to the prevalence of radio in the 1920s, where it goes from being a brand new invention to suddenly a mainstay in the American home. And programming of on TV was kind of like programming of radio in the 20s. It helps to create a mass culture across the United States as everyone's really sharing the same news, the same entertainment, the same sports, and so on. And a lot of that programming is aimed primarily at white middle-class suburbanites. And it's further reflected in the kinds of families and settings that TV shows depict, like a white suburbanite family like Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best or something like that. Another big buy in this new consumer culture is automobiles. And automobile ownership spiked. By the end of the decade, about 80% of households owned at least one car. And this became a measure of prosperity for many and a symbol of individual wealth. It's also going to fundamentally change the American landscape by introducing things like drive-through restaurants, drive-in theaters, and other things. In terms of the culture of the 50s, men were expected to be breadwinners in this new suburban America, and women were expected to find fulfillment as wives and mothers. Keep in mind that several million women had been forced out of the workplace after World War II, and in many respects were expected to kind of revert to a more traditional conservative gender role. And because women are expected to find their fulfillment as wives and mothers, we also see the baby boom, which is a very high birth rate after World War II. It's the biggest demographic bubble in US history. And this is going to be an enormously influential population moving forward through the rest of the 20th century, and even still are today. The gender roles that I'm talking about for women are also reinforced through the media, TV, film, and so on. Again, shows like Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy or Father Knows Best always depict women in a subservient position to the husband who controls the money. The wife is expected to stay home and take care of the kids and do homemaking and things. So we're all sharing in the same mass culture, and it's reinforcing for everyone the same kinds of stereotypes, social mores, and gender expectations. And the suburbs themselves were, like we've already indicated, overwhelmingly white. Real estate developers and banks oftentimes barred the resale of houses to non-whites. I mean, Levittown did that. They excluded African Americans from purchase or even resale. And as a result, as many whites are moving to the suburbs, many minority groups, including African Americans, became increasingly concentrated in city centers. This phenomenon of white flight means that with whites and with the money and wealth that they have, they're taking that outside of the city, and the good jobs and good schools follow them. And what remains in the cities are populations that are less affluent, and thus the government can't pull as much in property taxes from them, which means they can't pay for things like good infrastructure and good schools. And that begins a period of urban blight and urban decay, which leads to poverty and crime, and even, unfortunately, the image of the inner city that many Americans still hold today was really very much a reality in the beginning of the 1950s and 1960s. Question number 2, how were the 1950s a period of consensus in both domestic policies and foreign affairs? One of the big ideas for the 1950s is conformity and people's reaction to it. This is true politically, it's also true culturally, as we'll see. So our president in the 1950s is going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower. His vice president, by the way, is Richard Nixon. Eisenhower and Nixon will be elected in 1952. Eisenhower was a popular World War II general. He ran on the campaign slogan of "I like Ike," and he was actually courted by both the Republicans and the Democrats to be their nominee for president. But he will eventually choose to be the Republican nominee and thus will be elected as a Republican president. Weariness that the American people had with the Korean War helped him win. And when Eisenhower came in, though, even though he comes in on the back of concerns about labor strikes at the end of World War II, dissatisfaction with Truman's policies, weariness of the Korean War, he's not as much of an alternative to the Democratic status quo as you would think. So yes, he's a Republican, but the kind of nation we've created back in the New Deal is here to stay. He's not going to challenge that. In fact, his big package of plans, which he calls his new Republicanism, this new Republicanism continued the limited welfare state that had been created by the New Deal. So it doesn't reduce the size or the scope of government. This idea of a small government conservative Republican is really not the Republican of the 1950s. That's more the Republican of the 1980s and beyond. So Ike's new Republicanism doesn't reduce the size or scope of government. It continues the limited welfare state, and in some ways it actually expands the government's role. One example is that Federal Highway Act of 1956, which we already mentioned. This is a massive public works program akin to the WPA or the CCC back in the 1930s, and it employs tens of thousands of Americans to build the interstate highway system for years and years and years across the country. Eisenhower will also expand the government's role in education by signing the National Defense Education Act in 1957. The National Defense Education Act was basically the first federal student loan program, but these student loans were intended to encourage science and technology careers. In fact, the number of, it helps a lot of people get into college that wouldn't have otherwise been able to get into. So the number of college students went from like 3.6 million in 1959 to 7.5 million 10 years later. But the reason that these loans, the National Defense Education Act, were focused on science and technology is because the law was really a response to the Soviet Union's launch of the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, and then later, or rather a month later, Sputnik 2, which has a little dog in it named Laika to test whether or not, an animal can survive in space. This initiates the space race, and it really kind of frightens a lot of Americans that we are losing and we are behind the Soviets in terms of science and technology. And that's problematic in the atomic age. If the Sputnik satellite can go into orbit and fly over US airspace and we can't shoot it down because it's in orbit, what's to stop them from putting an atomic bomb or a nuclear warhead on that eventually? So this is a national security concern as well as an educational one. Now, Ike is presiding over a decade of conformity, like we already said, and there's quite a bit of political consensus, especially when it comes to the policies of the Cold War. So Eisenhower's foreign policy relied on so-called massive retaliation in response to Soviet aggression. It's the idea that we will use the greatest extent of our military force to check Soviet expansion. And this is dangerous because the greatest extent for us, our massive retaliation would mean atomic and now hydrogen weapons. So the US detonated a hydrogen bomb in 1952. And that puts us ahead for a very brief period of time because the Soviets will do the same thing in 1953. And we don't use the term hydrogen bomb anymore, but basically these are nuclear bombs. This is the standard that will be used moving forward, and we've not really advanced the technology significantly since this point. But this means that if we're going to follow a policy of massive retaliation, that we might find ourselves easily in a nuclear war that could destroy both sides, if not every living thing on the planet. So Eisenhower is accused by some critics of brinkmanship, of being eager or rather willing to bring the world to the brink of a nuclear war to solve foreign policy crises, because it's likely to result in mutually assured destruction. And this helps to encourage an atmosphere of fear and hysteria. People begin building bomb shelters, and schools practice duck and cover drills. So even though Americans are united in their desire, for the most part, to check the expansion of the Soviet Union, Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation does create increased fear that a nuclear war is a very real reality. 1950s under Eisenhower also sees the United States increasingly intervene in foreign affairs, especially in parts of the Third World, which are just countries that are not aligned to the United States or the Soviet Union. Nowadays, we tend to use the term Third World to refer to like economic status or poverty or something like that. But in really, the Third World originally just meant you're not aligned with the United States, the First World, you're not aligned with the Soviet Union, Second World, so you're Third World, you're unaffiliated. So we increasingly get ourselves involved in the Third World to try to continue to promote our strategy of containment. And we were oftentimes comfortable with supporting non-democratic regimes as long as they weren't communist. A really good example of this, and one that's going to be important later on, is that we helped to overthrow the government of Iran, who we believe is cozying up to the Soviet Union, and instead helped to install a dictator, and it's called the Shah. So the Shah of Iran is a brutal dictator that is put in place by the United States. And part of the reason that Iran does not have good relations with the United States even today is because after the Shah is overthrown later on, well, we're the one who put the Shah in power. So they eventually overthrow him. We are the symbol of, the evil that put him into power. Also, on a much bigger scale, we begin to get involved in Vietnam. And our involvement in Vietnam is a long story. But we'll start looking at it over the course of a couple of chapters. But in the 1950s, here's what's going on. Vietnam had been French Indochina, which had been a colony of France, obviously. During World War II, the Japanese take it and occupy it. After World War II and the Japanese are gone, the French try to reestablish their colony there. we support them in this. So we're helping the French with money and weapons and intelligence and other things because we believe that it would help to prevent the spread of communism. And we were also trying to convince France to join NATO. We have a situation where the Vietnamese have been fighting against colonial powers for their independence for decades. First against the French, then the Japanese, now the French again. And we're supporting the French because this nationalist movement, this revolutionary movement to create an independent Vietnam, is led by the Communist Party. So we are supporting the French in their imperialistic venture, at least in part, to prevent an independent communist Vietnam from coming into existence. Now, when the French are defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, they determine that they are going to withdraw and abandon their attempts to reestablish their colony. So the UN sets up a process to hold elections to form a country. Basically, the elections for this new country are going to determine the makeup of the government. These are called the Geneva Accords. That's the plan. Well, the US refuses to sign on to these because we realize that in that election, enough members of the Communist Party are going to win that it will be a communist government at that point. So essentially, because we know we're going to lose the election, we don't allow it to be held in the territory that we control because we've taken over from France at this point. And that's South Vietnam. So we urge the South Vietnamese government not to hold these elections. They don't. And they now form their own independent nation of South Vietnam that is not democratic, but is non-communist, and it's supported by the United States. North Vietnam, on the other hand, is communist, and it is an independent communist state, and it is led by Ho Chi Minh. More on him later. So the US is now responsible for propping up an unpopular government in South Vietnam that becomes increasingly repressive. We see this, though, as necessary to contain communism. We started to buy into an idea called Domino Theory, and it's the idea that if one country falls to communism, then its neighbors are far more likely to do so. Very much like a row of dominoes. So if we lose South Vietnam, then we're likely to lose Cambodia and then Thailand and Laos and so on to communism in a long row of dominoes falling. So as a result, Vietnam, even though it's not otherwise seemingly very important to American foreign policy, becomes really a keystone in our global fight to contain communism to where it already exists. Now, getting back to the conformity of the period, most Americans are increasingly focused on consensus and conformity in the 1940s, but there are certainly social critics that criticize the conformity of the post-war culture. And there are three books in particular that do this to great effect. One is The Lonely Crowd by David Reisman, which argues that Americans were more concerned with conformity than they were independence. Next, The Organization Man by William H. White argued that modern corporations were now turning employees into drones incapable of independent thought. Finally, The Affluent Society by John Kenneth Galbraith criticizes America's use of its newfound affluence and using that for consumer culture rather than continuing the New Deal state or the Keynesian economics of the New Deal state, arguing that not enough was being spent on public works and public programs. Popular culture in the 1950s was increasingly aimed at teenagers and oftentimes reflected some of the alienation of American youth. So rock and roll music, for example, is a good example of that. A new purely American art form that originates in the African American community will be eventually co-opted by white musicians like Elvis Presley. And it led to concerns in its day over juvenile delinquency. And in this respect, rock and roll is very much like jazz. Both originated in the Black community, both are quintessentially uniquely American art forms, both are eventually co-opted by white musicians and are cause for concern among many parents across the United States. We also have the Beat Generation, which are a group of writers and poets that rejected mainstream American society, especially the conformist elements of the 1950s. And they get their name from the idea that they're beat down by the conformity of society. So You've got writers and poets that are trying to reflect that. So Jack Kerouac's 1957 book, On the Road, reflects young people trying to live lifestyles that are rejecting the conformist middle-class culture. Allen Ginsberg's poem and book of poetry of the same name, Howl, Howl, in 1955 protested materialism and conformity. And again, another interesting parallel to the 1920s, I think, is that the lost generation, excuse me, the Beat generation is very much like the lost generation from the 1920s, that they are rejecting mainstream American society through poetry and works of fiction. And they're oftentimes, and the lost generation was focused on the materialism of the 1920s. The Beat generation is focused on the consumerism and conformity of the 1950s. So there's a fair number of parallels between the 20s and the 50s, and this is just another one of them. All right. Number three, what were the major thrusts of the civil rights movement in this period? So the United States was an unequal and segregated society in the 1950s. People were segregated or people experienced either de jure segregation, that means segregation by law. It's DEJURE. De jure kind of looks like jury or judicial, so it's by law. So in the South, people experience de jure segregation, where rules of this division are codified in state and local law. Now, everywhere else in the country, though, is experiencing de facto segregation or segregation by custom or practice. It's just a fact. So the rest of the nation, even though they don't necessarily have laws at the state or local level that prohibit the interaction of the races, they are practicing that in various other ways. So the NAACP, whose membership had swelled in the 1940s and 50s, looked to the federal courts to try to combat de jure segregation. And their big victory comes in 1954 when they argue and win the case Brown v. Board of Education. It's actually Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, but Brown v. Board of Education or Brown v. Board would be enough on the test. Brown v. Board of Education ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. Thurgood Marshall, who argued on behalf of Brown and the NAACP, guy in the middle there, argued that separate facilities created an inherent sense of inferiority. And interestingly, he used psychological studies to try to prove this by offering black dolls and white dolls to students to see which ones that they would pick. Psychologists Mamie Clark and Kenneth Clark found that the majority of the 253 black children in their study preferred the white doll over the dark doll. Some junior high school students associated light to medium skin tones with intelligence and refinement, and dark tones with meanness and physical strength. The lighter, the better, paralleled the assimilationist idea of the straighter the hair, the better. So students, simply by being segregated, had internalized society's message to them that they were inferior. And this is part of the way that Thurgood Marshall can argue that separate but equal cannot stand. That even if facilities are provided for equally, the separation in and of itself is a violation of the equal protection of the law. So Brown v. Board is a landmark Supreme Court case. It will overturn Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine from all the way back in 1896. And it signals that the federal courts are ready to support the efforts of the civil rights movement, especially this very socially activist court that's there at the time. This is the Warren Court. It's run by Earl Warren. He's the Chief Justice, and they're very socially activist in their rulings. We'll talk more about them later on. But in the meantime, this is a huge legal victory for the civil rights movement, but it's going to cause significant opposition from white segregationists in the South during the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, in 1955-1956, the Montgomery Bus Boycott signaled the beginning of a mass protest movement. It sparked, of course, by Rosa Parks' refusal to vacate her seat on a city bus. She had been a longtime civil rights activist, working for the NAACP for years. And in response, African Americans in Montgomery are going to protest segregated buses by refusing to use them for over a year. African Americans will refuse to ride city buses for over a year until they were desegregated. And this was a non-violent protest, and it's led by primarily African American churches in Montgomery, Alabama. Notably, the Montgomery Bus Boycott will see the emergence of a young pastor, Martin Luther King Jr., as a leader of the movement. And he's only 26 at the time. He had been deeply influenced by the nonviolent civil disobedience of Henry David Thoreau, the ideas of Gandhi, and he, after the Montgomery Bus Boycott, would move to integrate these kinds of civil disobedience ideas into a new civil rights organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. It's a new civil rights organization, but they're going to be pretty influential during the 1950s and 60s. Definitely worth knowing who they are. Now, Southerners are going to resist civil rights efforts, obviously. White Southerners especially resist school desegregation with so-called massive resistance. Massive resistance indicates that pretty much the whole of white Southern society mobilizes against these desegregation efforts in any way that they can. Now, part of what allows for this massive resistance, though, is that when the court rules in Brown v. Board of Education that schools needed to be desegregated, they said that this needed to be implemented with, quote, all deliberate speed. Well, that's vague, and it allows Southerners to delay through a variety of means, even closing down public schools in some states like Virginia for a time. Also, massive resistance is not just at the state and local level, it's also at the national level by Southern congressmen. So in 1956, a collection of 82 Southern congressmen issue and sign off on the so-called Southern Manifesto. This is a document that urged the people of the South to resist school desegregation and, not surprisingly, made use of states' rights arguments in echoes of the Civil War. Even though we've basically settled that argument in the Civil War, they bring it up again. Despite Southern massive resistance, the bottom line is that the federal government is on the civil rights movement side, but not for the reason that you would probably think. They're not on the civil rights movement side because they believe that it's the right thing necessarily, but rather the federal government is enforcing its own court decisions. It's enforcing its own laws. It's enforcing the federal government's supremacy over state law and state government. That's when you see the government get involved. So, for example, President Eisenhower will actually send federal troops to escort 9 high school students to Little Rock Central High School in 1957 to enforce court-ordered desegregation. So Governor Orville Falvis had used the National Guard originally. The governor of the state, Orville Falvis, real name, had used the National Guard to prevent this group of students, the Little Rock Nine, from attending. But he later withdrew them, but that left the students at the mercy of angry white mobs. So Eisenhower has to act. The show of force, again, is more about enforcing federal law than pursuing civil rights. I mean, he personally disagreed with the Brown decision. He later told Earl Warren that he could understand why Southerners wanted to make sure, quote, their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside some big black buck. So he holds some pretty profoundly racist views himself. But again, he's not supporting civil rights because he supports civil rights. He's supporting federal court orders, federal laws, and national supremacy over state law. Before moving on, worth noting, segregation becomes a national embarrassment, and it's going to be played up a lot by Soviet propaganda as part of the battle for the hearts and minds of people around the world. So we're claiming to be the nation of equality and freedom. Segregation clearly opposes that. So segregation stands in clear opposition to those ideals. So the Soviet Union likes to use that in international propaganda in an attempt to expose us as hypocrites. Number 4, pretty quickly, what was the significance of the presidential election of 1960? So the election in 1960 was one of the closest in American history. The Democrats will run John F. Kennedy, will become our first Catholic president and had to famously address his Catholicism to dispel fears of Vatican control. And this sort of anti-Catholic sentiment runs deep in American history. The idea goes all the way back to opposition to Irish immigrants in the early 1800s and many Protestant Americans tying their Americanness with being Protestant. So JFK is going to run for the Democrats. Vice President to Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, will now run for president for the Republican Party's nomination. This election will feature the first televised debates, which will greatly benefit JFK over Nixon. He's younger, he's more handsome, he comes ready for a TV program. I mean, he's wearing a sharp black suit, he's got movie makeup on, guy's wearing eyeliner. I mean, he's dressed in a way that he really pops off the screen and is far more striking than Nixon, who is, well, Nixon. And look at what he's wearing, a tan suit. He's not wearing any stage makeup. He's actually also coming off of being sick, so he looks kind of gross. When most people are watching this on TV, appearances matter, and most people who watched it on television thought JFK won, whereas most people who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon won. So in this case, TV actually helped sway the election based on appearances more so than perhaps ideas. JFK will get elected. He becomes the youngest elected president in U.S. history at only 43 years old. He and his glamorous wife, Jacqueline, will move in and preside over an elegant White House that will soon be nicknamed Camelot. And this really kind of represents at the time a passing of the torch to a younger generation, particularly the younger generation that had just fought in World War II. Now, before leaving office, Eisenhower is going to give a televised farewell address. In Eisenhower's farewell address, he will warn against the so-called military-industrial complex. He believed that this was a corrupting influence that could threaten liberty, that this relationship between industry and the military could threaten American liberty by creating more of a militant state. So even as a man who was a general, Supreme Allied Commander during D-Day, even he is wary of the militancy of the Cold War and how it's changing perceptions of American freedom.